This week we're going to continue our study. In Esther this week. Quick recap before we get started here, so everybody gets sort of settled. But the events here taking place here in Esther are from around 483 to 473 BC. You got to remember that the Jews here are living in Persia; they're in exile. If we back up to, they're in exile. Under the Persian Empire. If we're back at the 539 BC, that's when the Persian Empire was overtook the Babylonians who, the Jews were actually captured by the Babylonians in 585 BC. In 539, the Babylonians were defeated by the Persians and the Medes, and now the Jews here are living in the Persian Empire. In Cyrus, he allowed the Jews to go back to Jerusalem, the promised land that the forefathers had given to them, in 539 BC. Now the books here, we're reading today, they're not in chronological order. The last three books, Esther, Ezra, Nehemiah. Ezra, and Nehemiah, we're going to study those here later on, but those are two books that when the Jews are still in Jerusalem. Ezra is around 536 to 515. That's when the first exiles are going back to Jerusalem. And that happened about 30 years before we read this, where we're at today in Esther. And that's when they went back and built the temple. Then Nehemiah is around 30 years later, 30, 40 years later, give or take, depending on what date you start with. And that's when the walls around Jerusalem were rebuilt. Now, if we back up to chapter 1, the first lesson we had a couple weeks ago, we see that King Ahasuerus was introduced. They talked about how he's the ruler of the large Persian Empire. There's 127 provinces in all. In the first lesson, he held like a 6-month party for all the nobles and all the princes of the land, of all the provinces that he was in charge of. And at the very end of that 6 months, he held a 7-day feast for all the people in the land there, that was there in the Persian capital. And one of the things he did, he allowed everybody to drink all he wanted to drink. The king probably had too much wine, or it says he did have too much to drink. And so he sent for Queen Vashti to come before the party that he was giving to wear her crown, to show her beauty. We see that Queen Vashti refused, and the king became angry, so he sought counsel from these wise men. And they issued a royal decree that Vashti would no longer come before the king, and that her position would be given to someone better than that she was. So this was done to warn all the women throughout the provinces that they should honor their husbands. And once this decree was given, it could not be changed. So that's what so that brings us up this lesson this week, where there's going to be a new queen sought to replace Queen Vashti. And before we get into the lesson, announcements. Miss Frankie just told me a while ago that she is going to be moving to Franklin tomorrow to be in assisted living. So this will be Miss Frankie's last day here for a while. So we'll miss her.
I'm really gonna miss everybody.
Yeah. But she's like I said, there's assisted living. I think I know what you're talking about on the south end there of Franklin. But anyway, so let's all remember her. Big change for her. Anybody else?
Y'all still pray for Terry. He's just not.
Your brother Terry?
He is
Yes.
not doing it.
I saw him for Tuesday. Yeah, I noticed that. That's Lance Joe's brother Terry Stinson. We all know him, Terry and Taretha, but continue to remember him. Anyone else?
We got a message in the ladies' prayer group last night from Evelyn Miller, and their daughter Tony has a daughter Carly, and Carly has a 3-month-old baby boy, and he died. So the Millers have lost their great-grandchild. His name, I think, was Joseph. 3 months old.
Okay.
Like I said, I don't know the details, but it would be taking our prayers.
Okay. Jerry and Evelyn Miller, I repeat that again, they lost a great-grandchild. Friday night?
babysitter just, what they told me was the babysitter just went, when he was asleep, and found that he wasn't breathing.
Wow.
So they were TJ Friday night, went on, almost all night. They were all already gathered there to Jerry and them to celebrate Christmas yesterday. It's a rough time, they're struggling with that.
That's terrible, yeah. It's terrible. Remember that family, that's awful.
Keep Mike in your prayers. He's got a nasty cough, cold, chest cold.
Remember Mark, he's not here today.
My granddaughter, Faith, is having knee surgery this week. Praise her.
My granddaughter have a surgery this week, babe. Where's she at? Bone Green or?
Both.
Anyone else?
And a friend starts therapy on her neck and shoulders tomorrow because she's got arthritis real bad in her neck and shoulders. But the doctor did release her from her hip. So,
And one thing's another, huh?
yeah, tell me about it.
Anybody else? Okay.
I think you ought to talk about his basketball star daughter there when he gets up. She's a breakout star here, scoring 30 points in a game.
Yeah. But she plays like her mama.
Yeah, that's right. Hey, same way with Reed, I guess. That's the same.
Yeah, Reed's never say what you want.
Plays like her mama.
If you would bow with me. Most kind and gracious Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day and all that you've given us. We thank you for allowing us to gather here together and study your word. Dear Lord, we pray that you'll be with Jerry and Evelyn Miller and their family, that you'll give them comfort as only you can. We pray, Lord, that all those who's mentioned this morning who are having medical procedures or medical issues, that you would be with them, that you would be their strength, and that you'll guide them through their issues. We pray for Miss Frankie. We pray that you'll be with her and that she'll know that we all love her and that you'll be her strength. Go with us throughout this service. Help us to learn and to praise your name throughout. Forgive us of our many sins and thank you for your Son, Jesus. In Christ's name, amen. This morning I'll be reading from Esther chapter 2, verses 1 through 11. After these things, when the wrath of King Ahasuerus subsided, he remembered Vashti, what she had done, and what had been decreed against her. Then the king's servants who attended him said, "Let beautiful young virgins be sought for the king, and let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom, that they may gather all the beautiful young virgins to Shushan the citadel, and to the women's quarters under the custody of Haggai, the king's eunuch, custodian of the women, and let beauty preparations be given them. Then let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti." This thing pleased the king, and he did so. In Shushan the citadel there was a certain Jew whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite. I think I said that right. Kish, who had been carried away from Jerusalem with the captives, who had been captured with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had carried away. And Mordecai had brought up Hadassah, that is, Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman was lovely and beautiful. When her father and mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. So it was, when the king's command and decree was heard, and when many young women were gathered at Shushan the citadel under the custody of Haggai, that Esther also was taken to the king's palace, into the care of Haggai the custodian of the women. Now the young women pleased him, and she obtained his favor, so she readily gave beauty preparations to her, besides her allowance. Then 7 choice maidservants were provided for her from the king's palace, and he moved her and her maidservants to the best place in the house of the women. Esther had not revealed her people or her family, for Mordecai had charged her not to reveal it. And every day Mordecai paced in front of the court of the women's quarters to learn of Esther's welfare and what had been happening to her.
Thanks, Trey. All right, lesson this week is called the Search for a New Queen. Now, verse 1, you know, it's interesting here. It said, Troy read there, it says, when his wrath subsided. Between chapters 1 and chapters 2, it's believed to be about a 3-year period in between the two chapters. The reason we know that because the first week we said that in the third year of King Ahasuerus' reign, or Xerxes, is when he threw the party, and then Queen Esther was crowned queen in the 7th year. There was a year of preparation, so that had been 6. So there's about a 3-year period in between chapters 1 and chapters 2, which is pretty important there. You know, and during this time, of course, the reason that there's a gap here is because they went to war. The Persians had went to war. The Greco-Persian War had went to war with the Greeks, and they went to battle. They were defeated. That's when we talked about the first week there when the Persian Navy, the naval fleet was destroyed by the Greeks. And so after they suffered defeat, you know, King Ahasuerus came back to Shushan here. You know, the kingdom wasn't lost, but it had been weakened. So he returned home and spent a lot of time with building projects, building up. Instead of trying to capture different countries and expanding the kingdom, he spent more time building infrastructure and buildings and stuff like that. And in this week too, we're introduced to 2 new characters, which are probably the most important characters, or 2 of the most important characters in this book, is Esther and Mordecai. And we said a couple weeks ago, Esther is basically a orphan child. Her mother and father had died, and also too we see Mordecai, who was her dad's nephew, took care of her. So it made, you know, I mistakenly said the first week that was her uncle, but actually it was her first cousin who took care of her and raised her during this time after the death of her parents. So we'll go ahead and get started on these questions here. And question number 1. At what point in David's life did the attendant seek a young woman to care for him? Oh, yeah. Yeah, I'm going to go back and touch on this real quick, this story here. We remember, I think it was a couple quarters ago when King David had became old, he was cold, and he brought in the young virgin, Abishag, to lay with him to keep him warm. Of course, the importance of that is once she came to him, she was part of his harem. She was part of his, you know, he owned her at that point in time, and that's what we're sort of going to get into today. And we remember there too when, at one point this out, you know, Adonijah, or, you know, his stepbrother, asked his mother, Bathsheba, if he could have her as his, and then that's when Solomon had him killed, because once you were property of the king, had you became, you know, that was somebody's, if he'd given her to Adonijah, then that maybe gave him a right to the kingdom there. So, you know, the king's harem was pretty important here. And usually when something happened, the king's harem was, you know, David's harem was passed on to Solomon. And we saw that when Absalom had, you know, tried to take over his father's kingdom, what did he do? He took the concubines up on top of the rooftop and did things with them to show that he was, you know, that was important to show possession there. And you look back too, as far as the kings, you know, did God ever want Israel to have a king? You know, when you went back up, you know, 700 years before, you know, God never wanted Israel to have a king. They wanted a king. So all these things that we see with the kings and stuff, all these traditions that even the Israelites at one time had done, this was not God's plan. This was something that was sort of, the Israelites did have kings. They did sort of have these same traditions that were being done here we see today, but this was not because of God's plan. So I wanted to point that out because I think it'll come in, you know, in play here. And also too, another thing too, the eunuchs, you know, we talked about last couple weeks ago, the eunuchs, why were they in charge of the harem? Because they weren't allowed to have children. They couldn't father a child, so they were no threat to the king, you know. But that's why, you know, but if you're a part of the king's harem, then you were a possession. It was very important that you sort of stay inside of that harem for forever. Any comments? Question number 2. Whom did King Ahasuerus remember once his rage had subsided? Vashti, yeah. And, you know, again, we talked about this is 3 years later. He says he remembered her. When you read this, do you think he may have missed her? I think he did, you know, I really do. Because you think, you know, this is 3 years past. And you know, he'd been to war, he came back, and he seemed like he's lonely here. And he's got a whole harem full of females. I mean, he's got plenty of people to pick from. But yet there's just something there he's missing, you know. So you look back, you know, even though he got rid of Vashti last week, even though she's a prized possession, you know, probably that was someone special to him. But now it's too late, you know. We talked about last week at the house lesson, you know, he got drunk. He commanded her to come for him. She didn't come. So he banished her. And he banished her and it says he banished her from the kingdom. You know, it never says she was killed, you know. And I don't know what the real answer to that is. I don't think any of us know. But either two things happened. Either she was banished or she was in his harem still. Because like we talked about before with Abishag, you couldn't just let her go. Because if you let her go and somebody else took possession of her, then they would have sort of a right to the kingdom there. So either she was banished or she'd been killed there. But you know, some people think that maybe he was missing her and maybe even wanting to bring her back as queen. Of course, if he brought her back as the queen, it would show weakness. And but either, you know, so that's why they sort of developed this plan here to bring her back as to go out and find another queen. Of course, I think we learned some lessons from last week, you know, too. You know, alcohol's not a good thing. And don't listen to bad advice. Don't make rash decision. And this is what, and in his case, you know, he should have waited. Because I think, again, you know, I think here 3 years later, from what you read here, you know, I think he misses her. He realized probably he made a mistake here, but wasn't no going back. Yeah.
Being married, so the power is still, there's a lot of power within the household, whatever it is. And she was the queen, and she had power, and she exercised it. And he made her mad, and this is what happened. Of course, it looks like it's all God's will here, but still, he made her mad. And going forward, don't realize her power too.
Makes you think, you know, before you do something, you need to think twice, you know.
Well, there's ramifications for everything.
Yeah.
There's unintended consequences.
Yeah. Again, you know, that's where sometimes you gotta watch who you listen to. Because, you know, you got good friends that give you good advice, you got bad friends that give you bad advice. And to me, he got some bad advice here because, you know, he wouldn't show her who was boss, and he did. But consequences 3 years later were that he probably, again, he had a whole harem full of women, yet he still wasn't happy. Question number 3. What a book of the Apocrypha has a story about a young, beautiful girl who became the wife of one of the main characters? Tobit. Again, you know, author, he likes to reference these books, but again, this book, just real quickly, it was a apocryphalic book written around 200, 400 AD, you know, way past all the events here written here. And I read too that these books, a lot of these are included in the Catholic Old Testament. They're great reading, nothing wrong with reading them, but they're not inspired. So, but yeah, it seems like author here always references those type of books there. Question number 4. After the king's wrath subsided, Who suggested the king to search throughout the kingdom for beautiful young virgins? The servants, yeah. And, if we back up in last week's lesson, in chapter 1, it was the wise men he talked about who advised him there that they should go out and find someone to replace Vashti. But today, the servants probably saw his state. The people who served him probably saw how he was, and they decided he needed someone else. Of course, this is it's probably not a good way to spend. You look at it, not a good way to spend the taxpayers' money. But this is sort of the problem with the kings. Everything was done to please the king. And when we get into this in just a moment, these girls that were chosen, was this a good thing or a bad thing for them? It's not good. Yeah, it's not a good thing here. This is terrible. Because you got these young girls, they're all throughout these different provinces. And they're basically taken from their homes. They're brought to Shushan. And they're trained, or they're given all these beautification, I don't know if that's the right word, but for a whole year preparing to meet the king or to see the king or whatever. But they become part of the king's harem, just like we was talking about Abishag a while ago. Once you became part of that harem, you were done. So, like someone described it, it's almost like perpetual widowhood. Once you got in there, and if you weren't, it was all or none. If you were chosen for the queen, that was good. But if you were one of the other people who weren't chosen, you were just part of his harem. You was a possession from there on out. You weren't able to marry anyone else. You weren't able to have children unless the king, you had a child with the king. But you were a possession of the kings from there on out. It's not a pretty. I may be going too far, but it's almost like a modern day to me. It's almost like modern day child trafficking. Sort of the same way, because they just brought these young girls from all over these different provinces and brought them in, and then they couldn't leave. They were there forever. So it's we read about this, you look at it, but for these young girls that were chosen, we see Esther was chosen, and she became queen, and the results were good for her. But for all these other young girls that were there, it wasn't a good thing for those. So any comments or questions so far? Okay. Question number 5. What did the king think about selecting a new queen to replace Vashti? He was pleased, yeah. He's getting him a new trophy bride, you might say. He's getting him a new... and what were the requirements to be queen? Beautiful, young, yeah, and virgin, And of course, there's lessons to be learned there, young and a virgin, that's good, but beautiful, it shows the beautiful, it shows the king's priorities. He just wants someone to look good, look the part, you might say. Here it works out pretty good for him. He gets Esther, when we read about Esther, that was, obviously he made a good choice there as far as choosing a queen, but, a lot of times, we marry for looks, it don't always work out. And I read someone said that, over time beauty fades and all the hunks become chunks, so you don't. I thought it was funny. I read that. Somebody said that, but that's funny. But anyway, but you got to realize over time, I know this has nothing, but and we all know this, but in life, it's definitely important to who you marry again. But but there's something about Esther too. We're going to talk about here in a few minutes. Esther, there's something more to her than just beauty. Esther had a lot of great qualities, in which made her again. Allowed her to, in the end, become queen of the Persian Empire. Question number 6. What was the name of the city where the king's citadel was located? Shushan, yeah. We talked about that a couple weeks ago. It's Iran today. Point out here too, probably, and we talked about too that there's different capitals, but this is probably the king's winter home. Mordecai and Esther, from what we can tell, they already lived there. We know they lived there. So it's interesting that, you know, they searched all 127 provinces and brought all these people in, but yet Esther was there, you know, close by, who ended up being chosen as queen. And who was the king of Judah when Nebuchadnezzar destroyed Jerusalem? Yeah. And is he a good king or a bad king? Usually pretty easy to guess. I always guess bad, and you'll be right about 75% of the time. But yeah, he's probably wasn't a good king there. Question number 8. What was Esther's Jewish name? Hadassah, yeah. And Hadassah, it said it means myrtle tree. It's, you know, peace, love, prosperity. Again, her Persian name, which we refer to Esther, which means star. And you think about too, Esther. Again, when she changed her name, I don't really know if we know, but she was, I hate to say this, you know, almost like a local girl. She'd been living in the Persian Empire. Well, of course, it became the Persian Empire in 539, but they'd been carried off by the Babylonian Empire from, you know, for over 100 years. So she was 4 or 5 generations removed from Jerusalem. So I'm sure she's probably very fluent, or her, you know, probably she was, you know, you wouldn't be able to tell unless you knew that she was not from Persia or that area, you know, by her speech and all that stuff. You know, she didn't have any of the, she probably may have known Hebrew and stuff, but again, I'm sure she was as Persian as anyone who lived there. You know, that was actually a native Persian or whatever. But anyway, she'd been there for 4 or 5 generations there, I would assume. Question number 9. Who was Esther's cousin and caretaker after her parents died? Mordecai, yeah. And we talked about earlier, he adopted his uncle's daughter. He raised her as an orphan. And it showed, too, he pretty much loved her as his own daughter. We can see that, you know, how much he cared for her. They sort of also, too, think he had some sort of official capacity or official role in the citadel there. You know, he was allowed to be outside. You know, they said he could be a possible doorkeeper. You know, even, and I'll mention this, there's no proof about it, but they also mentioned, too, he may have even been a eunuch himself. Because you think about it, they never talk about him having children. I mean, that I know of, and maybe we'll run into that later on. But you never mention about having children, or his own wife, his own family, and so that's a possibility there. Whether or not, I have no idea, but that's just been mentioned. Also, too, in the reading there a while ago, he was a Benjamite. Of course, we know that the 2 tribes of the southern Judah were or 2 tribes of the south were Judah, and the tribes of Judah and Benjamin. And what was Saul? King Saul was a Benjamite too. So he was from the lineage of Kish, and they mentioned that a while ago. And I don't know if we'll get into this later on, but I'm not going to too far, because I'm always afraid to go any further into these. You know, Haman, a couple chapters, or maybe the next chapter over, we start talking about Haman and stuff, and he was Haman the Agagite. And remember when Saul, when they defeated the Amalekites, he was supposed to kill King Agag, and he didn't. So actually, Haman was a descendant of the king that Saul was supposed to kill some 600 years earlier. So, you know, that's a little twist in the plot there, but we'll probably get into that in a couple weeks from now. But again, we'll back up here. You know, Esther. But we're talking about Mordecai and Esther and how much Mordecai loved Esther. You know, this wasn't something that they wanted her to be in this situation, to be put in this position, to be in this pageant or whatever you want to call it. But, you know, they didn't want her to be there because, you know, with her being taken in to be chosen or to be a candidate, you know, that meant there's only one winner and a bunch of losers. And I think Josephus said, of course, it's outside the writing of the Bible, but, you know, we know there's 127 provinces, so you assume there's at least 127 people there or more if everybody had one. But Josephus said there's over 400 people, 400 ladies or young girls that were in this situation. So there's quite a few women or young virgin girls that were there. So, so her to be chosen as queen, it was. We'll talk about here later. How that was. We feel like God, had a hand in all that was going on. Question number 10. What was the name of the eunuch in charge of the prospective replacement of Vashti? Haggai, yeah. And what they say, of course, he was a eunuch. You think about Haggai too, he plays an important position here because he probably had a lot of influence. It showed that, he really thought Esther was it said verse 9, she was a young woman, she had pleased him, she obtained his favor. He gave her 7 maidservants. He gave her the best place in the house of the women. So for some reason or another, Haggai took a liking to Esther, which is important here because if he was in charge of the women, he probably chose who went before the king at certain times and stuff. So he may have positioned her at the right time to go in. King's having a bad day. He saved Esther for another time. Or he may put 2 or 3 duds in front of her. I don't know. But I'm just saying, but I'm just saying there's reasons for that, but again, there's he was in charge of a lot of beautiful women, but for some reason or other, he chose Esther to be sort of the one he sort of picked himself for the king, and then we said that's what happens. So, any questions or comments up to this point?
We talked about position and power of different people in the reigning of the kingdom there. He didn't have huge power as the king did, but over those 480 girls, he had tremendous power.
Right.
So for Esther to be noticed by him, either by her choosing or his choosing or God's providence, it was the right person put her in the right position to allow her to be presented as the future queen.
Right, yeah. And again, it wasn't something that, and I thought about it too, it's not like God made him choose Esther, but he put him there, and he also gave Esther special qualities that made her desirable to him, So, it, sort of everything sort of meshed together there for that to happen. Any other comments? Okay. This is an interesting question here. Why do you suppose Mordecai advised Esther not to reveal what people she belonged to? Yeah, again, I don't think there's no right or wrong answer. Anybody else have any?
He wanted for her what he wanted, and so he didn't want anything to get in the way. So, as she said, this might get in the way, and he saw the path, and he wanted for it, and he just didn't want that confusion.
And it's interesting, because again, they ask this question, it's like you should know the answer, but there's really no answer to it. I've thought about it. Of course, Dave Gillespie, you think about a lot of things here and try to read on it. It could have been we hear the word anti-Semitism now, like a lot of people just dislike for the Jews. That could have been something there in that area. But again, you got to realize too, there's 127 different provinces here, so it's just not like all these are young Persian women. These are women from all different races and all different groups. So it's not just like they all were, blonde and blue-eyed girls. They were all different. The whole spectrum, you might say, of beautiful women throughout the world, throughout that area. So we talked about earlier, she's probably a local. We assume she was raised there in Shushan. She had a Persian name here already, Esther. She probably, again, spoke fluent Persian, so it's probably hard to differentiate her from other people. But like Sean was saying, he's probably, she's in this, I don't want to call it beauty contest or this contest to become queen or a bad episode of The Bachelor, however you want to look at it. But it's like you've got, you want to win. You know, there's no second place in this deal. So you're giving her every opportunity that you can to win. You know, she's an exile here too, and we see other exiles that were, you know, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, even Mordecai. What happened to them when they were confronted about their religion? They owned up to it, yeah. But we don't see that with Esther here. Again, but you know, you can't blame her in a way, because I'm not saying you can't blame her, but you know, had she have shown her Jewish beliefs, if she had practiced her Jewish beliefs, you know, it may have been something that kept her from getting to where she needed to be. But also too, if she didn't reveal that she was Jewish, what did she do? Probably she worshiped pagan gods if they were required to do that during that year's time. Probably certain foods that she probably ate of during that time too, also, that she probably, if she had said, I'm Jewish. So, you know, the point is, you're probably, you know, her being Jewish, even though if it was a bad thing, or, you know, it might have been a disadvantage to her. And so she may have brought more attention to herself. You know, if they said, well, we're going to do this today, she said, I can't participate because I'm Jewish. That may have been against her. If they said, I want to do this, you know, you sure say something? Mm-hmm.
She was there to take the remnant and bring them back. God's plan, but you know, Joseph went down, found favor, and so did she.
Yeah, and again, I'm not up here criticizing Esther. You know, sometimes you have to do, you know, sometimes and it's you know, it's easy for us to sit here. You know, we live in the Bible Belt of the world. I talk about that all the time. It's easy to be a Christian in Allen County and Scottsville. You know, if you were to, you can almost, and I hate to say this, you can also almost use your faith or your religion to improve your standing in the community in this area. If you were to come into this area and say, if you didn't have a belief in God, or you're an atheist, you know, you're probably not going to be looked upon in this area as well. So it's easy for us to do this. But again, you know, I've never been in a part of the world or lived anywhere, or, you know, I'm not talking about in the United States or even other countries where that if you showed your faith, that it would be to your disadvantage. And I never had that happen to me. So, you know, to sit up here and criticize someone until you walk in their shoes, it's easy to act all like, you know, like we know what we would do in that situation, but we really don't know. But you know, she was in a tough situation there, and again, like I said, I think you know, the moral of the story at the end of it, you know, God's plan worked out, but it's interesting there, all that is. Any comments or questions? Question number 2. Why did the eunuch who was a custodian of women show special treatment toward Esther? You know, there's no right or wrong answer to that. It just...
Also people along the way did. So I think God, where you're meant to be, God gave her those attributes or qualities that, you know, it's more than just her beauty. The trafficking, I'm sure it was so beautiful.
God given, yeah, we see that in people that have something just sometimes more special than others. You listen to that personality. Someone else say something over here.
I understand. You found favor.
Yes, there's no right or wrong answer to that, you know, but it's just one of those things that there's a lot of. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah.
In the text here it says, when Haggai learned that Mordecai also looked after Esther the eunuch, may have given his adopted father, or not probably special privilege. So he saw an outside interest with Esther as well, so that might be part of it too. If he had any status, Mordecai, you know, that might have helped Esther inside as well.
And I know
We just don't know his status.
We don't know, yeah, because, you know, you think about, well, if Mordecai wanted her to hide the fact that she was Jewish, then how much did they know her Mordecai would give? If they knew that Mordecai was rough, then they obviously knew she was Jewish, but then was Haggai Jewish? I mean, we don't know, you know what I'm saying?
And we don't know if he was hiding his background either.
Yeah, we don't know, yeah.
Well, he had a Persian name, so
Right.
that tells you something.
Yeah.
Yeah. But even Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are Persian names. So they were all given Persian names,
Yeah,
usually once they were captive.
but they blended in with the Persian.
They did blend in very well.
That's the way they survived.
Correct.
And maybe Mordecai did also till the end, till when he was forced to,
Reveal.
you know, he was forced to worship someone else, and that's when he decided not to. I'm not sure how Mordecai was at this point. They knew Mordecai was Jew, but it was something later on that became.
Well, they were gonna have to figure out how they were Jews when the decree came that they were gonna be annihilated, so they were gonna be able to, if they wanted to annihilate all the Jews, they were gonna have to figure out a way to know who they were.
Yeah.
And this is Jew shepherds.
And that's interesting too, and I hadn't thought about that, you know, if you got Mordecai and Esther lived in lived in this area, and not everybody can look at them and say they're Jewish, and how do you know who is Jewish when it's all said and done? When you go to kill them. Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. Maybe we'll figure that out here in a couple of weeks, I'm not sure. Question number 3, how do you suppose Mordecai learned what was happening to Esther when he paced in front of the court of the women's quarters? Yeah. Again, you know, it don't really tell us anything at all there about that, but obviously, you know, whatever he was doing, he found enough information about her to satisfy him and to keep going back every day to see what was happening. But, you know, as far as what was happening, it really doesn't say. And this question we'll have to answer this quickly, but, and this is probably, I'm sure we'll come up with this a lot more here in the future. It says, what evidence does Esther provide that God in his providence was watching over his people Israel? I guess we just need to think about that question, because I'm sure it's going to be asked about 3 more times between now and the time we finish this book. But, you know, again, it shows that, you know, and this, at least as far as this lesson goes today, that God put Esther in a place, or allowed her to, I guess this week's lesson, the providence in God showed that where there's 127 or 400 women that were actually going to be chosen to be queen, that she somehow or another became elevated to the point that she became queen, and which, again, throughout the rest of this book is going to be very important. So, thank you all.